What the Buddha taught about anger in the Dhammapada, in the verses traditionally gathered in the Dhammapada, anger appears not as an abstract concept, but as a living force, something that visits the mind, takes residence in the body, and shapes the world we see. These teachings did not emerge from a quiet study or a removed philosophical distance. They arose from deep observation of human life, of kings and beggars, of monks and householders, of people torn apart by rage and people slowly liberated from it. When the Buddha spoke of anger, he was speaking to anyone who has clenched their jaw in silence, anyone who has replayed an old wound long after the moment has passed, anyone who has felt the heat rise and believed, even briefly, that this heat was who they were. Anger is one of the oldest fires known to the human heart. It burns quietly at first, a warmth mistaken for strength, a sense of certainty in a world that often feels confusing and unjust. Yet when it grows, it consumes far more than its target. It consumes clarity, it consumes tenderness, it consumes the fragile space in which understanding might arise. Long before modern psychology named it, long before neuroscience traced its pathways in the brain, the Buddha looked directly into this fire and spoke of it with an honesty that was neither condemning nor indulgent. He did not describe anger as a moral failure, nor did he romanticize it as righteous power. He spoke of it as a form of suffering that mistakes itself for protection. This reflection is not a lecture and not a set of instructions to suppress emotion. It is an invitation to walk slowly with a teaching that has survived for centuries because it speaks to something timeless. As you listen, imagine not a distant sage, but a quiet presence beside you, someone who understands the weight you carry and offers not judgment, but a lamp in the darkness. Anger, seen clearly, becomes not an enemy to defeat, but a doorway through which freedom can be glimpsed. The Buddha's teaching on anger begins not with blame, but with recognition. Anger is not portrayed as a monster that invades from outside, nor as a permanent stain on one's character. It is described as a condition that arises when the mind encounters pain and lacks understanding. In this sense, anger is deeply human. It is the tightening that follows disappointment, the sharpness that arises when expectations collapse, the inner protest against a world that refuses to align with our wishes. To see anger clearly is to see how deeply it is woven into our desire for things to be otherwise than they are. In the modern world, anger is often justified, even celebrated. It fuels movements, sells headlines, and gives a sense of identity in a fractured age. Yet beneath these loud expressions lies something more intimate and more painful, the sense of being hurt, unseen, or threatened. The Buddha's teaching does not ask us to deny this pain. It asks us to see it clearly. It invites us to sit beside the fire of anger, not to throw more fuel into it, and not to run away, but to understand how it begins, how it sustains itself, and how it can finally go out. Yet the Buddha does not suggest that anger arises without reason. He points instead to its roots in craving and aversion. When something we want is threatened, or something we dislike comes too close, anger appears as a kind of guardian. It stands at the gate of the heart, sword raised, shouting warnings. The tragedy is that this guardian does not know how to rest. Once invited in, it demands constant vigilance. It replays old injuries, imagines future insults, and keeps the nervous system in a state of readiness. The body tightens, the breath shortens, sleep becomes shallow, anger, meant to protect, becomes a jail. One of the most striking aspects of the Buddha's approach is his refusal to grant anger moral authority. Even when harm has been done, even when injustice is real, anger is not praised as a noble response. This is not because the Buddha was indifferent to suffering, but because he saw how easily anger compounds it. To act from anger is to allow the injury to replicate itself, moving from one heart to another. The Dhammapada repeatedly returns to this theme. Hatred does not end through hatred. This is not a sentimental statement, but a practical observation. Anger feeds on reaction. It grows stronger when it meets resistance or justification. In the Dhammapada, anger is often paired with its consequences rather than its causes. This is a subtle but profound choice. Instead of asking endlessly why we are angry, the teaching asks us to notice what anger does. When anger arises, the mind narrows. The world becomes smaller, sharper, and more divided. There is a strong sense of I and they, of right and wrong, of victory and defeat. In that moment, compassion feels distant, and wisdom feels impractical. Anger promises clarity, but what it delivers is distortion. It convinces us that harshness is honesty, and that cruelty is strength. The Buddha's teaching invites us to observe this process directly. Rather than identifying with anger, we are encouraged to notice it as a visitor. This does not mean denying its presence or pretending calm. It means recognizing that anger is something the mind experiences, not something the mind is. This distinction is subtle but transformative. When anger is seen as my anger, it becomes personal, justified and defended. When it is seen as anger arising, it becomes a phenomenon, something that can be studied, understood, and released. Consider how anger feels in the body. There is heat, tension, a sense of urgency. These sensations are not neutral. They shape perception. When the body is inflamed, the mind becomes impatient. Subtlety is lost. We interrupt more easily, listen less carefully, and interpret neutral events as hostile. The Buddha understood this intimate connection between body and mind. To speak of anger is to speak also of the breath, the muscles, the heartbeat. Anger is not just an idea, it is an experience that takes over the whole organism. The Dhammapada often contrasts anger with patience. But patience here does not mean passive endurance. It means the capacity to remain present without being driven. Patience is the strength to stay with discomfort without immediately seeking release through reaction. In this sense, patience is not weakness, but a profound form of courage. It requires facing the rawness of feeling without the armor of blame. When anger arises and is not acted upon, something unexpected happens. It reveals its impermanent nature. It crests, lingers, and eventually fades, like a wave that cannot sustain itself without constant wind. This does not happen through force. The Buddha did not advocate suppressing anger or shaming oneself for feeling it. Suppression only drives anger underground, where it becomes resentment or bitterness. Instead, the teaching emphasizes understanding. When anger is understood, its energy changes. It may still arise, but it no longer commands obedience. There is space between the feeling and the action. In that space, choice becomes possible. In the Dhammapada, the image of the self is often challenged. Anger thrives on a solid sense of self that feels attacked or diminished. When this self is questioned, anger loses its footing. Who exactly is being insulted? Who is being threatened? These are not intellectual questions, but experiential ones. In moments of deep attention, the solidity of the self begins to soften. What remains is sensation, thought, memory, and reaction, all moving and changing. Anger depends on a fixed point to defend. When that point dissolves, anger has nowhere to stand. The Dhammapada also speaks to the social dimension of anger. Anger is contagious. One harsh word invites another. One act of cruelty legitimizes the next. Entire communities can become shaped by shared resentment, passed down like an inheritance. The Buddha saw this clearly in the conflicts of his time. and his words resonate just as strongly in an age of digital outrage and constant comparison. When anger becomes a shared identity, it blinds groups as effectively as it blinds individuals. In this light, the work with anger becomes not only personal, but ethical. To understand anger is to reduce suffering in the world, not through grand gestures, but through small, unseen acts of restraint. The Dhammapada does not glorify these acts. It does not promise recognition or reward. It simply points out that peace begins where anger is not allowed to rule. As we reflect on these teachings, it is important to remember that the Buddha spoke to people who struggled as we do. His path was not designed for ideal beings, but for ordinary humans, caught in extraordinary confusion. Anger was not something he pretended could be eliminated overnight. It was something to be known, gradually, patiently, through lived experience. Each moment of recognition weakens its hold. Each moment of non-reaction plants a different seed. Yet within this bleak observation lies a quiet hope. If anger spreads through imitation, so does restraint. If hostility can ripple outward, so can calm. The Buddha's teaching suggests that one mind free from anger has a stabilizing effect far beyond itself. This is not mystical thinking, but an acknowledgement of human interdependence. A calm presence de-escalates tension. A listening ear softens defensiveness. A refusal to retaliate interrupts the chain of harm. In the next part of this reflection, we will look more closely at how anger sustains itself through memory and story, and how the Buddha's insight offers a way to step out of this cycle without denying the reality of pain. For now, let these words settle. Notice what arises in you as you listen. Anger may appear, or resistance, or relief. Whatever comes, allow it to be seen. This simple act of seeing is already a movement toward freedom. Anger does not live only in the present moment. One of its most powerful hiding places is memory. The Buddha understood that much of what fuels anger is not what is happening now, but what has already happened and has not been released. The mind, once hurt, learns how to return to the wound. It revisits old conversations, replays injustices, sharpens forgotten words into weapons. In this way, anger becomes a story the mind tells itself about the past, a story that keeps the heart braced for attack even when no danger is present. This is why anger can arise suddenly, without any obvious trigger. A sound, a tone of voice, a passing image can open a door to a memory long stored away. The body responds as if the original threat has returned. Muscles tighten, the breath shortens, the heart races. In these moments, it feels as though anger has a mind of its own. Yet the Buddha's insight invites us to look more closely. What we call anger is often grief that has not been acknowledged, fear that has not been named, or longing that has been denied. The Dhammapada points again and again to the danger of dwelling on what has been done to us. This dwelling is not reflection, and it is not healing. It is fixation. When the mind fixates on past harm, it keeps the nervous system in a state of readiness, as though vigilance could somehow undo what has already occurred. Anger, in this sense, is an attempt to regain control over a time that is no longer accessible. It is a refusal to accept the irreversible nature of experience. Acceptance, as the Buddha used the word, does not mean approving of harm or excusing injustice. It means recognizing what cannot be changed and ceasing to fight reality itself. Much anger is born from the silent protest. This should not have happened. While that protest is understandable, it keeps the wound open. The mind argues endlessly with the past, and in doing so sacrifices the present. The Buddha saw clearly that suffering multiplies when the mind insists on replaying what it cannot alter. There is also a subtle pleasure hidden in anger, one that the Dhammapada hints at without embellishment. Anger can create a sense of identity. It gives shape to the self as the one who was wronged, the one who sees clearly, the one who refuses to forget. This identity can feel stabilizing in a world of uncertainty. Letting go of anger, then, can feel like losing a part of oneself. The Buddha did not dismiss this fear. He understood that anger often survives not because it is painful, but because it is familiar. This is why mindfulness plays such a central role in the Buddha's approach. Mindfulness is not a technique to calm down anger by force. It is the practice of seeing clearly what is happening as it happens. When anger arises, mindfulness notices the heat, the contraction, the speed of thought. It notices the urge to speak or act. It notices the stories forming. This noticing creates a pause. In that pause, the spell of anger weakens. The Dhammapada's wisdom is uncompromising in this regard. It suggests that the mind becomes what it dwells upon. If it dwells upon injury, it becomes injured. If it dwells upon hostility, it becomes hostile. This is not a moral judgment, but a description of mental conditioning. The mind is shaped by repetition. What we return to again and again becomes the lens through which we see the world. When the Buddha spoke of freedom from anger, he was not speaking of emotional numbness. He was speaking of a different relationship to feeling. In this relationship, emotions are allowed to arise and pass without being woven into a narrative of self. Anger, when not fed by story, has a surprisingly short lifespan. It flares, expresses itself through sensation, and then fades. It is the story. This happened to me, they are always like this. I must protect myself, that gives anger its longevity. The Buddha compared the untrained mind to a city without guards. Anything can enter, anything can cause chaos. Mindfulness is the guard at the gate, not preventing visitors from arriving, but seeing who they are before letting them roam freely. When anger arrives and is immediately acted upon, it takes over the city. When it is seen and understood, it may still pass through, but it does not burn the houses down. The Dhammapada speaks of victory and defeat, and it does so in an unexpected way. To defeat another through anger is not true victory, because it strengthens the very force that causes suffering. True victory is mastery over one's own mind. This mastery is quiet and often invisible. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. Yet it is the only victory that does not create a new enemy. There is also a deep compassion in the Buddha's teaching on anger, one that extends even to those who cause harm. This compassion does not arise from moral superiority, but from insight. To see anger clearly is to see that those who act from it are themselves suffering. Their actions are driven by confusion, fear, and unmet longing. This does not excuse harm, but it reframes it. When the heart understands that anger is a symptom of suffering, the urge to retaliate loses some of its force. In modern life, anger is constantly stimulated. News cycles thrive on outrage. Social platforms reward sharpness and speed. In such an environment, restraint can feel unnatural, even irresponsible. The Buddha's teaching does not ask us to withdraw from the world, but to engage with it wisely. Wisdom here means knowing when anger is arising and choosing not to let it dictate our response. This choice is not made once, but again and again in small moments that rarely draw attention. As anger loosens its grip, something unexpected emerges. The mind becomes more spacious. Listening deepens. The body relaxes in ways it had forgotten were possible. This is not because life becomes easier, but because resistance softens. The Buddha's teaching does not promise a world without provocation. It offers a heart that is less easily provoked. It is important to acknowledge that some anger arises from real injustice. The Buddha did not deny the existence of harm in the world. What he questioned was whether anger is the most effective response. Anger may ignite action, but it rarely sustains it without distortion. Actions born from anger tend to replicate the patterns they oppose. The Dhammapada suggests that clarity, rooted in compassion, is a more reliable guide. Compassion does not mean passivity. It means acting without hatred, speaking without cruelty, and resisting harm without becoming its mirror. As we move deeper into this reflection, the question becomes not how to get rid of anger, but how to live without being governed by it. This shift in perspective is subtle but decisive. Anger may still visit, but it no longer rules the house. In the next part, we will explore what it means to cultivate a mind that remains steady even when anger arises, and how the Buddha's teaching points toward a freedom that is both gentle and profound. For now, allow these words to rest in you. Notice where memory still tightens the heart, and where understanding begins to loosen it. In this space, forgiveness may arise, not as a moral obligation, but as a natural consequence of understanding. Forgiveness, in this sense, is not about the other person. It is about releasing the burden of carrying the past into every present moment. The Dhammapada does not frame forgiveness as an act of generosity toward the offender, but as an act of wisdom toward oneself. When anger is no longer fed by memory and story, something subtle yet profound begins to happen. The mind discovers a different kind of strength, one that does not rely on domination or defense. This strength is quiet. It does not announce itself with force. It appears as steadiness in the midst of agitation, as a softening where there was once rigidity. The Buddha's teaching, as echoed in the Dhammapada, points toward this steadiness as the natural outcome of understanding, not as an achievement to be claimed. The Buddha often spoke of training the mind in the same way one might train the body. Just as physical strength develops through repeated patient effort, mental freedom grows through repeated acts of awareness. Each time anger arises and is met with clarity rather than reaction, a new pathway is strengthened. The old habit of immediate retaliation begins to weaken. This is not a dramatic transformation, but a gradual reorientation of the heart. One of the most misunderstood aspects of the Buddha's teaching is the idea of non-self. When applied to anger, this teaching becomes deeply practical. Anger feels personal. It feels like a response to something done to me. Yet when observed closely, anger reveals itself as a sequence of conditions, a perception, a sensation, a thought, an impulse. None of these on their own constitute a solid self. They arise and pass according to causes. Seeing this does not make anger disappear instantly, but it changes the relationship to it. Anger is no longer a verdict on who one is. It becomes an event and awareness. To live without being governed by anger does not mean that life becomes smooth or that conflict disappears. It means that the mind learns how to remain present even when conditions are difficult. This presence is not passive. It is attentive, responsive, and deeply alive. When anger arises in such a mind, it is recognized early, before it hardens into speech or action. There is a moment of choice, sometimes very brief, in which awareness intervenes. In that moment, the habitual chain is interrupted. The Dhammapada often returns to the image of the wise person as one who is difficult to provoke. This is not because such a person is indifferent, but because their happiness does not depend on external conditions aligning with their preferences. They have learned, through direct experience, that reacting with anger only deepens suffering. This learning is not intellectual, it is embodied. It lives in the breath that remains steady, in the voice that does not harden, in the pause that allows a different response to emerge. This shift has profound implications. When anger is no longer tied to identity, there is less need to justify it. The mind does not have to defend its presence or prove its legitimacy. Without justification, anger loses much of its fuel. It may still arise, but it does so in a softer form, less insistent, less convincing. Over time, the space around it grows wider. There is also a deep sense of dignity in this way of being. Anger often humiliates the one who carries it. It pulls the mind into narrowness, into behavior that later brings regret. To refrain from anger is to protect one's own integrity. The Buddha understood this well. His teaching does not frame restraint as self-denial, but as self-respect. To refuse to be ruled by anger is to honor the capacity for wisdom that exists within every human being. Compassion plays a crucial role here, not as sentiment, but as understanding. When the heart sees clearly that all beings are driven by conditions, the sharp edge of blame begins to soften. This does not mean that harmful actions are ignored or accepted. It means that they are seen in context. The Buddha's compassion was not blind. It was rooted in insight into the causes of suffering. From this insight arises a response that seeks to reduce harm, rather than perpetuate it. In daily life, this might look very ordinary. It might be the choice to remain silent when a harsh word is spoken, not out of fear, but out of clarity. It might be the decision to speak firmly without hostility, to set boundaries without contempt. These moments rarely attract attention. They do not make headlines, yet they are the moments in which the teaching comes alive. The Buddha did not promise that this path would be easy. He acknowledged that anger has deep roots, nourished by habit and reinforced by culture. What he offered was confidence that change is possible, not through willpower alone, but through understanding. Each time anger is met with awareness, its grip loosens. Each time the mind chooses clarity over reaction, it moves closer to freedom. Anger, when seen clearly, is revealed not as an enemy to be crushed, but as a teacher pointing toward unexamined pain. The Buddha's words in the Dhammapada do not ask us to harden ourselves against feeling, nor to excuse harm done by others or by ourselves. They ask us to look directly at the fire and to understand what keeps it burning. In that understanding, the fire loses its power to consume. Over time, something remarkable happens. The mind begins to trust stillness. It no longer fears the pause between stimulus and response. In that pause, creativity emerges. New ways of relating become possible. Problems are addressed without escalation. Pain is acknowledged without being weaponized. The heart becomes a place where even difficult emotions can arise without causing destruction. This is not a state of perfection. Anger may still appear, especially in moments of fatigue or stress. The difference lies in how quickly it is recognized and how gently it is held. The Buddha's teaching does not demand that we never feel anger. It invites us to stop being owned by it. This is a liberation that unfolds in small, cumulative steps, often unnoticed until one day the mind realizes how much lighter it has become. If these reflections resonate with you, allow them to linger. Return to them when anger arises, not as rules to follow, but as reminders of what is possible. This channel exists to offer such reminders, to explore the teachings not as distant philosophy, but as living guidance for a complicated world. If you feel supported here, you are welcome to continue walking with us, listening, reflecting, and learning together. In this shared attention, something quiet and powerful can unfold. The simple relief of not adding more suffering to what already exists. To live in this way is to walk gently through a world that often feels harsh. It is to carry one's own pain without passing it on. It is to recognize that every moment of restraint, every moment of clarity, quietly reshapes the mind. This path does not promise recognition or reward. Its fruit is subtle and deeply personal. A heart that is less burdened, a mind that is more at ease, a life lived with fewer regrets.